Dust settled in Dry Creek, like an old secret. The town sat crooked at the edge of a parched valley. The buildings slouched from years of wind and sun, their wooden bones creaking even in silence. Rattlesnakes curled under the porch steps, and the air carried the sharp sting of sagebrush and heat. It was a place forgotten by time, not quite dead, but long since buried by anything resembling luck. Silas Grant moved slowly through the morning haze, his limp dragging a soft arc in the dirt behind him. He was lean as a fence post, with a sun-darkened neck and eyes the color of old tin, eyes that had once seen too much and now tried not to see at all. Each morning he rose before the sun, before the world had a chance to press its weight on his shoulders again. With calloused hands, he fed the hens, checked the fences, and mended what could be mended. The ranch was modest, 20 acres of dry, stubborn land with a lean barn and a sagging porch, but it was his. More importantly, it was theirs. Inside the house, laughter floated from the kitchen. Miriam, his wife of 17 years, hummed as she flipped cornbread in a pan. She had a braid like a rope and a fire in her voice that could keep wolves at bay. Caleb, their eldest at 16, tall and quick-eyed, practiced rope tricks out back, while Levi, just 9, chased a stray goat in a race he was never meant to win. Silas leaned against the porch post, sipping from a tin cup. For a moment, the world felt clean. It wasn't wealth or ease that made a life. He'd learned. But the breath between burdens, the spaces where laughter echoed louder than regret. That morning, he caught Miriam's eye through the window, and she smiled. He smiled back. No one in Dry Creek paid Silas much mind. He wasn't the kind to linger in the saloon or trade stories at the general store. Folks figured he was another failed prospector, a drifter who'd settled down and buried his past under a few feet of hard dirt. They weren't wrong, but they didn't know the whole of it. Silas preferred it that way. That night, the wind came sharp and strange. The coyotes didn't howl, and even the horses stood silent in their stalls. Silas lay in bed, eyes open, sensing something brittle in the darkness, the kind of stillness that comes just before bones break. The first crack of gunfire snapped through the quiet like a whip. He shot upright. Miriam was already moving, grabbing Levi from his bed. Caleb burst through the hallway, pale-faced and wide-eyed. Silas reached for the shotgun above the mantel, heart hammering. Outside, flames licked a barn like hungry tongues. Shadows moved against the firelight, mounted men, armed and laughing. A voice rose above the chaos, loud and cruel. Burn it all. Take what's worth taking. Leave the rest for the buzzards. He knew that voice. Rafe McCall, the vulture. The name alone made barkeepers stutter and lawmen turn the other way. Rafe was a ghost in 3 territories, a raider, a killer, a man who didn't leave witnesses. He rode with 10, maybe more, each one meaner than the last. They didn't just take, they devoured. Silas pushed his family toward the root cellar trapdoor, hidden beneath the rug. Go. Now. Miriam hesitated. What about you? I'll hold them off. His voice was steel. You stay quiet. No matter what. But Levi clung to his mother's leg. Caleb, trying to be a man, stood his ground with a knife in his hand. Then the door shattered. They were inside in seconds, rough men with cold eyes and dirt-smeared hands. One grabbed Miriam. Silas fired. The man fell, but another swung the butt of a rifle into Silas's ribs, dropping him hard. A boot caught his jaw. He tasted blood. They dragged Miriam and the boys from the cellar stairs. Caleb fought, slashing wildly before he was thrown against the hearth. Levi cried out, his voice shrill with panic. Silas tried to rise, but a knee drove into his spine, pinning him like a wounded animal. And then Rafe stepped in, tall, dressed in black, with a silver concho on his hat and eyes that gleamed like broken glass. He looked down at Silas with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. Well now, he said, kneeling. What's this broken mule got that's worth guarding so hard? Silas tried to speak, but pain clamped his throat shut. You got lucky out here, old man. But luck runs dry. Rafe stood, torched the house. No survivors. No, Silas croaked, but it was a whisper swallowed by the roar of fire. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was Miriam screaming his name, her arms held tight by one of the riders, and Caleb lurching forward before the butt of a gun silenced him forever. Then came the flames. They danced through the rafters, devouring the home he'd built with his hands. They flickered across Miriam's face, her features contorted with terror and rage. And Levi, small and shaking, vanished in the smoke. When Silas came to, the world was quiet again. Ashes drifted in the moonlight like snow. The roof was gone. So were the walls. Only black skeletons of furniture and timber remained, crackling in the final breaths of the fire. He tried to move. His leg wouldn't obey. Blood slicked the ground beneath him. And the bodies. Miriam lay not far off, her hand stretched toward the spot where the cellar had been. Caleb's form was crumpled near the well still. Levi. He couldn't find Levi. A sound left Silas then, not a cry, not a scream, but something deeper. A sound born from the bones, dragged from the marrow of a man who has watched the world he loved reduced to ruin. The stars watched in silence. The wind carried no comfort. He crawled forward, every inch in agony. He touched Miriam's fingers, still warm. "I'm sorry," he whispered, choking. But no one answered. In Dry Creek, fires often burned. But that night, a different fire was lit, one that didn't show in flames or smoke. It smoldered behind Silas Grant's eyes, under his skin, deep in the ruins of his soul. And it would not be put out. The road into Dry Creek was long and unkind, a crooked ribbon of cracked stone and choking dust. Silas walked it barefoot, one boot lost somewhere back near the smoking remains of his home, the other dragging uselessly behind a shattered leg. Blood dried in streaks down his face, black beneath the rising sun. Flies circled his wounds, and the wind, sharp and unfeeling, carried with it the last ashes of his life. By the time he reached the outskirts, he was little more than a ghost in a man's shape. A stable boy spotted him first and dropped his pail. Word spread fast, even before his shadow fell across the sheriff's porch. Sheriff Jenkins squinted at the figure limping down Main Street. His gut clenched before he even recognized the man. The sheriff had seen plenty of death in his years, Indian raids, drunkards with pistols, men cut open over cards. But something in Silas's face chilled him more than a body ever could. "Silas," the sheriff rasped, stepping forward, hand instinctively resting near the butt of his revolver. Silas didn't stop. He climbed the wooden steps one at a time, each movement stiff and deliberate. When he finally spoke, his voice came low, as if dredged from some cold, dark place. "They're dead." Jenkins swallowed. "Your wife?" Silas nodded. "Both boys." The sheriff took off his hat. "I'm real sorry, Silas. We will send someone to bring them in proper." Silas's lip curled, just barely. "Won't be anything left." Jenkins opened his mouth, then closed it again. He knew what came next. "Was it McCall?" Silas nodded again, slower this time. "Took everything. Burned it all." The sheriff looked away, jaw tightening. "Rafe's got 20 men riding with him. Maybe more now. We ain't got but 5 able hands who even know how to fire straight. You know that. You gonna do anything?" Silas asked. "I can't," Jenkins said, barely able to meet his eye. "You go after him. You'll just be the next body in the dirt." "I died already." Silas turned and limped away, leaving a silence on that porch that felt like a closing door. By the time he reached the edge of town again, people had stepped back into their homes. Curtains twitched. Voices fell quiet. Dry Creek was a place that survived by looking the other way, and Rafe McCall had taught it long ago that staring into the fire only got you burned. But Silas wasn't looking away. He found himself in a field west of town, kneeling in the brittle grass beneath a dying cottonwood. His limbs trembled, not from weakness, but from restraint. Rage sat in his chest like a coiled rattlesnake. He dug with his bare hands. The earth here was dry and stubborn, just like it always had been. But beneath a foot of cracked soil, his fingers hit something solid. A long wooden box. He paused, then opened it. Inside lay a duster coat the color of storm clouds, neatly folded despite the years. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, rested a cold peacemaker with an ivory grip, etched with the letters SB, just behind the trigger guard. And beside it, a saddle, black leather worn smooth at the seat, marked with a faded Union Army crest, scorched halfway off. He didn't touch them yet. He just stared. And then the wind rose. "There are men who live to bury the past," the old voice whispered in memory. "But sometimes the past has claws." Silas sat with those words, sat with the coat, the gun, the life he'd promised himself he'd left behind. His fingers trembled as he unwrapped the Colt and checked the chamber. Clean, oiled, as if it had waited for him. That night, no one saw him return to what remained of the ranch. Only the coyotes watched as he lit a single lantern in the cellar. They saw his silhouette move through the wreckage, like a spirit unburied. He found the loose boards in the floor, the ones even Miriam hadn't known about. Underneath, more tools, wrapped and hidden. A knife with a notch for every kill. Spare shells. A leather satchel of maps and sketches. And a folded paper with a name, Rafe McCall. He unwrapped each item slowly, carefully, with reverence, like a priest dressing for the last mass. Over the next few days, Silas was nowhere to be found. The general store clerk said he came in once for jerky and whiskey, and said not a word. Someone saw a figure out near the ridge trails, just before dawn, but no one got close. Even the drunks in the saloon started to whisper when they spoke his name. "Heard he used to be with the Bluecoats," one muttered. "No, he was a bounty killer. Worked the Rio border. Disappeared after he killed a whole camp of rustlers. Heard he once shot a man in the neck from 400 feet out, just to make a point." Jenkins heard the talk, but said nothing, just stared at the horizon more often than before. One night, smoke rose from the hills again, but it wasn't a fire. It was a signal. Silas stood beneath it, freshly shaven, the duster falling past his boots like a shadow given shape. The gun hung on his hip, but it might as well have been an extension of his arm. He moved different now, straighter, tighter, like a man with purpose instead of pain. There was no limp. The saddle was strapped to an old gray mare he'd never named, but who followed him now, like a ghost tethered to its master. Her eyes were calm, as if she'd seen worse in another life. Silas mounted. His face, once slack with sorrow, now held something sharper, an edge honed by fire and time. Not hatred, something colder. Justice. He turned toward the canyon trails and disappeared into the red dusk. Back in Dry Creek, no one spoke his name aloud anymore, but they all thought it. Boone. Not Silas Grant, the quiet rancher. Boone. The gun from Black Hollow. The shadow of the war. The man who once made entire towns vanish into whispers. And now he was riding again. Long before the calluses on his hands were shaped by fence wire and hay bales, they had been molded by steel and blood. The man they called Silas Grant had once ridden under another name, a name that echoed through war camps and whispered along saloon walls like a curse half-spoken. Lieutenant Silas Boone. He had worn Union blue with quiet fury, a ghost in the smoke of battlefields from Shiloh to Fort Donelson. But Boone was no officer in the ordinary sense. He was the bullet sent in before diplomacy, the knife that cut the throat of hesitation. He rode with orders that never touched paper: eliminate, dismantle, silence. An assassin for a cause too noble to admit it needed such things. The last of those missions had taken him deep into rebel-held land, chasing down a Confederate captain who had butchered towns and left the dead nailed to crosses. Boone found him in Missouri, drinking beside a church fire. The duel lasted 5 heartbeats. Boone's shot hit true. The captain's boy, no more than 12, had screamed into the ashes and run at him with a rusted knife. Silas never forgot the sound the child made when he fell to his knees in the blood of his father. That night Boone vanished. He threw his badge into a river swollen with snowmelt and headed west, where names could be reborn and silence was cheaper than penance. He built a life with hands that once killed for country. He found love with a woman who never asked what his eyes had seen. Miriam had saved him with her steadiness, her kindness, her refusal to see the monster in the man. But monsters never sleep forever. The ghost stirred now with every draw of his Colt. He set up makeshift targets in the canyon flats, tin plates, old bottles, rusted lanterns. At first, his fingers were stiff, unsure. Then muscle memory returned, like a song half remembered. Draw. Fire. Holster. Again. Draw. Fire. Faster this time. Always faster. The crack of gunfire echoed off the red rock, scattering birds into the sky. By dusk, the ground was littered with broken metal and shattered glass. Silas's eyes gleamed not with triumph, but with grim necessity. He rode hard through the arroyos each morning, training his body to obey again. The limp faded. The man returned. One evening, as he was tightening the cinch on his mare's saddle, a voice piped from behind a mesquite bush. "You really gonna shoot him all by yourself?" Silas turned sharply, hand brushing the butt of his revolver. A skinny boy with wild hair and wary eyes stepped out, arms raised in mock surrender. He looked no older than 12, but carried himself with the kind of caution only loss could teach. "I ain't here to steal nothing," the boy said quickly. "Just been watching. Heard your shots for days now." Silas said nothing. His eyes scanned the horizon. The boy followed his gaze. "They killed my pa," the kid said, quieter now. "Same as yours, I guess." "What's your name?" "Benji." Silas studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "You hungry?" The boy nodded quicker. They shared beans over a small fire, speaking little. Silas learned that Benji had been a stable boy for a ranch outside of Hollow Creek. The gang had burned it to the ground. He'd survived by hiding under a dead mule until the riders moved on. "That smell stuck to me for days," Benji said, voice cracking. "I didn't even cry. Not till later." Silas didn't offer comfort. He wasn't sure he could anymore, but he let the boy stay. The next morning, Benji was still there, boots dusty, eyes alert. He followed silently as Silas trained, sometimes fetching stray cans, sometimes just watching. Days turned into weeks. They didn't speak of family. Not anymore. Some things didn't need to be said twice. Silas began venturing into town again, quieter than before, but with purpose in his eyes. He drifted from saloon to saloon like a shadow, listening. Men always talked when whiskey ran deep. He heard where McCall had last been seen, riding south with new riders, bleeding a trail across the territory. Rumors whispered of a cache stashed near Widow's Canyon, of alliances formed with a corrupt land baron east of the Trinity Range. Silas made notes, drawn maps, crossed names. He left a coin at the feet of a blind old scout in the Dry Creek alley, who muttered, "Devil rides with black feathers now. But the storm is changing direction." Even Sheriff Jenkins, who once shook like a leaf, now simply tipped his hat and stepped aside when Silas passed. The desert wind shifted. You could feel it in the way the dust curled around your boots, in the way even the dogs in town fell quiet as he walked by. There was something in the air that hadn't been there before. Not just grief, not just vengeance, a reckoning. One morning, Silas stood atop the mesa with Benji beside him, the dawn splitting the sky in burning reds and golds. Below, Dry Creek looked like a toy town, peaceful, unknowing. "You scared?" Benji asked. Silas thought about it. "I was. Now I remember who I am." Benji nodded, like that made perfect sense. Silas holstered his revolver. The metal felt warm against his hip, alive somehow. Some men bury their past. Others become it. And a few, a rare few, sharpen it like a blade and carry it into the fire. Silas Boone was riding again, and hell was riding with him. The canyon held its breath. Silas crouched behind a curtain of sagebrush, high above the horseshoe bend where the trail funneled into a natural choke point between the red rock walls. The air shimmered with heat, the kind that rose off stone like breath from the mouth of the earth. Two riders approached below, their laughter faint but clear, careless, arrogant. He watched them through narrowed eyes. Both wore the gang's colors, red neckerchiefs, dark coats, pistols swinging low at their sides. One had a broken front tooth that glinted whenever he grinned. The other wore a rabbit's foot on his belt, stained dark at the edges. Silas didn't move. When they reached the turn, he stood. Two shots cracked like thunderclaps. The echo bounced down the canyon, sending a hawk screeching from its perch. Both men slumped in the saddle, lifeless before they hit the dirt. The horses scattered. Silas descended with the steady, soundless pace of a man long acquainted with death. He searched their bodies, took maps, ammo, and a small journal with crude drawings. supply routes, drop points, names scrawled in misspelled fury. One name had a circle around it, Boone. Beneath it. Find out. Confirm. They were looking for him. Good. He rode hard that night, wind tearing through his coat like claws. Near midnight, he reached the Mesa Cave. It was tucked behind a blind turn, invisible unless you knew where to look, and he did. It had once been a smuggler's den, long before Rafe's gang claimed it. He lit the whiskey crates first. Flames roared up like judgment, then the ammunition, then the sacks of dried meat and grain. Explosions thundered deep inside the cave as Silas rode away, silhouetted by firelight against the cliffside. The smoke billowed for hours, visible for miles. It was a message painted in heat and ruin. By morning, the outlaws woke to hunger and rage. Rafe McCall slammed his fist against the cave wall, sending pebbles tumbling. His face twisted, not in fear, but insult. Find the son of a bitch. But Boone didn't wait for them. He led them. 5 of them came next. They followed rumors, bits of trail, whispers in saloons. Silas fed those rumors himself, leaving scraps behind like breadcrumbs. A glove here, a spent shell casing there, a whittled figure on a tree stump shaped like a vulture's beak. Each clue drew them deeper into the hills, toward the abandoned mining town of Calder's Grave. It sat hollow and windblown at the base of the Black Ridge, a skeleton of what had once been 20 cabins, a saloon, and a stamp mill. Dust coated the floors. Doors hung open, creaking in the wind. Shadows loomed in corners like old debts waiting to be paid. Silas waited in the tallest building, the foreman's shack, where glass still clung to one cracked window. He watched as the outlaws arrived, uneasy, eyes scanning every broken rooftop. They split up, like wolves sniffing for meat. That was their mistake. The first went down in the livery, a wire strung at neck height between the stalls. The second met his end behind the general store, where Silas dropped from the roof and slit his throat before the man could draw. The third and fourth died together, standing back to back in the street, too nervous to separate. A single shot split the silence, then another. Both crumpled like dropped puppets. The fifth, just a boy, ran. Silas chased him through the mine shaft entrance, the walls closing in with every echoing footstep. The boy tripped, crawled, turned, trembling, a pistol too large for his hand aimed clumsily. "I didn't want none of this," he cried. "They made me." Silas raised his gun and paused. The boy's face twisted in fear, snot and tears mingling. He couldn't have been more than 16, just like the one back in Missouri, just like the boy who had run at him with a knife, whose screams still haunted his sleep. He lowered the gun. "Go," Silas growled. The boy hesitated. "Go." He ran. Silas stood alone in the shaft for a long while, staring into the black. Later, near the gang's desert camp, far enough not to be seen, but close enough to leave a scar, he knelt beside a sandstone boulder and pulled his knife. The blade scraped stone with a harsh whisper as he carved the words deep and slow. "Boone rides again." He lit no fire that night, just stared at the stars until they blurred into ghosts. Word reached Rafe by sundown. 5 more dead. A 6th missing, raving about a phantom in Calder's Grave. This wasn't vengeance anymore. It was a war, and the man they thought they had buried was writing his gospel in blood. The wind howled through Devil's Spine like a prophet warning the doomed. The jagged ridge stretched out like a spine of some ancient beast turned to stone, its bones cracked and sun-bleached under a sky bruised with storm light. Silas stood alone at the summit, duster flapping behind him, the Colt at his side polished like a mirror of death. He had chosen this place for the same reason he had once bled here, because it was impossible to forget, because it was the only place savage enough to swallow a man like Rafe McCall. Below, the path twisted and narrowed into a natural gauntlet between razorback rocks and sheer drops, a canyon so cruel and crooked that even mountain cats avoided it. Silas had fought Comanche raiders here once, long ago, when he still wore a uniform and orders still meant something. The rocks remembered, and now they would bear witness again. He worked through the night, like a carpenter building a coffin. Tripwires hidden in scrub, loose shale placed on narrow ledges, gunpowder charges packed into hollowed crevices, Tinkin alarms. He marked fire lanes with chalk and stone, set up perches for quick movement, and tested the draw from every angle. When the sun rose again, the traps were buried and the path was death. And still he waited. Rafe was coming. That much he knew. Word had spread of Calder's grave, of the burned whiskey, of the names carved in stone, and the ghosts now filling the wind. Rafe rode with 8 left now, hardened killers, men whose hearts beat only for gold and gore. But Silas had seen harder, and he had already buried more. As the first hoofbeats echoed off the walls of Devil's Spine, Silas closed his eyes and listened. He could tell by their rhythm how tired the horses were, could sense the weight of gear. He counted them as they came, 9 shadows weaving through the canyon, all armed, all laughing. He didn't move. The first explosion ripped through the rocks like thunderclap. Shards of stone shredded 2 riders before they had time to scream. The rest scattered, cursing, drawing iron, not yet knowing where to aim. That was the gift of Devil's Spine. It gave you no clear enemy, just 1,000 places to die. Silas moved with the wind. A shadow on the ridge. The second man fell with a shot through the eye, slumping off his horse like wet canvas. The third tripped a wire and tumbled into a ravine, screams silenced by jagged stone. Then came the chaos. Gunfire cracked like dry bones snapping. Horses shrieked and bolted. One man caught sight of Silas's silhouette and raised a carbine, but the bullet missed and Silas didn't. He reappeared behind a rock 50 feet farther, killing 2 more before the echo of the last shot had died. By the time the dust settled, smoke curled in long fingers across the ridge, and only 2 figures remained, one standing, one staggering. Rafe McCall bled from his thigh, his coat torn, his hat lost somewhere along the rocks. He leaned on a boulder, wheezing, pistol shaking in his grip. And there, across the broken ground, Silas emerged like a ghost made flesh, gun lowered, eyes cold as river ice. "Well, I'll be damned," Rafe muttered, spitting blood. "It really was you." Silas said nothing. "I heard stories," Rafe went on. "Silas Boone, the ghost from Black Hollow, the butcher of Arapahoe Ford. I figured it was legend. No man walks away from all that." "I did." "Yeah, you walked away." Rafe's grin twisted, sour with pain. "Found a pretty little wife. Had your chickens and your fence posts. Thought you could build a new name on rotten bones. Ain't that right, Boone?" Silas stepped closer. The wind caught his coat, tossing it open just enough to show the gleam of his revolver. "You ran from the fire," Rafe sneered, dragging himself upright. "While men like me lit it. You hid, for years, like a goddamned coward." Silas's voice was gravel when it came. "I wasn't hiding. I was healing." Rafe raised his pistol. "Then you should have stayed in your grave." Silas drew. The shot was a thunderclap that silenced even the wind. Rafe's pistol clattered to the rocks. His body followed it, face still locked in a snarl of defiance even as the life drained from his eyes. Silas holstered the Colt, shoulders sagging with a weight not even vengeance could lift. Around him, the cliffs of Devil's Spine stood silent. No cheers, no witnesses, just stone and dust and the whisper of a storm building on the horizon. He looked down at the dead man one last time, then turned and walked into the wind. Dry Creek rose over the horizon like a faded memory, all splintered wood and wind-whipped dust, quieter than usual under the dull hush of dawn. Silas came down the ridge slow, one arm pressed tight against his ribs, blood soaked deep into his shirt, dried dark and cracking. His boots dragged through the gravel, worn soles whispering like dry leaves. The Colt was holstered but heavy at his side, as if it, too, remembered the weight of what had just been done. The town watched him return, not with applause, but with silence. Curtains shifted. Doors creaked open, then shut again. Even the dogs didn't bark. The only sound was the wind trailing behind him, brushing the ground like the edge of a funeral veil. Sheriff Jenkins met him outside the jailhouse, hat in his hand, eyes squinting through the dust. He didn't say a word at first, just looked at the man before him, the coat torn at the sleeve, the face streaked with sun and blood, the eyes that seemed to carry centuries instead of years. Then finally he asked, "Who the hell are you, Silas?" Silas didn't stop walking. He just said, quiet and even. Just a man who lost too much to stay quiet. He passed the sheriff, boots striking the boards like a slow drumbeat. Jenkins didn't follow. Didn't need to. The answer was enough. By noon, word had spread. Rafe McCall was dead. So were his riders. Devil's Spine had swallowed them all. No posse, no backup. Just one man. One name. And yet, Silas made no speech. He didn't ride through town with his gun raised high. He simply returned to what was left of the ranch. Smoke-stained stones. A blackened well. The bones of a life once lived. Benji was already there. The boy had built a small shelter with his own hands, patchy and crooked, but dry. He looked up as Silas approached, eyes full of the kind of questions no child should have to ask. Silas didn't answer them. He just said, "You still hungry?" Benji nodded. "Always." So they worked. They didn't talk much. Didn't need to. The ground was hard, but they made it yield. One row of beans, then another. A coop patched from burnt timber. A new fence line strung tight. Silas taught him how to plant, how to repair a harness, how to read weather by the way the clouds leaned on the hills, but not how to shoot. When Benji once asked about the revolver hanging on the cabin wall, Silas only said, "Tools have purpose. Some belong to the past." The boy never asked again. Time passed, as it does in places that don't ask for it. A new house rose slowly beside the ashes of the old. Nothing fancy, just enough. The town softened to Silas. Folks nodded now instead of looking away. A loaf left on the steps. A hammer lent without a word. They didn't forget what he'd done, but they didn't speak of it either. Some stories aren't told aloud. They're carried. Then one day, he was gone. No warning. No goodbye. Just an empty saddle in the barn, and a quiet stillness in the morning air. Benji waited a day. Then 3. Then a week. He searched the trails, checked the ridge, rode into town and back again. But Silas Boone, Silas Grant, was nowhere. No grave. No blood. No clue. Just wind and silence. The cabin stood untouched. Inside, the duster coat hung from a single nail, faded and stiff, sleeves long enough to wrap around a legend. Beneath it, the colt rested on the table, polished, loaded, silent, waiting. Out in the desert, where the wind never forgets, they say a man once burned his past beneath the dust, only to rise when justice cried louder than grief. Some say he walked still, a shadow in the canyons, watching, waiting, listening for the next fire. Others say he found peace at last, buried beneath a nameless hill with the dust for his pillow. But Benji? He just plants his fields and looks to the horizon each evening, as if expecting that silhouette to ride down out of the sun once more. And inside the cabin, in the hush before dawn, the wind sometimes moves that old coat, just a little, as if someone brushed past, as if the past, once buried, was never truly gone, only resting,